The logging railroads in Lincoln, New Hampshire were first formed back in the 1870s as a means to harvest the vast stands of old-growth timber that were inaccessible to the logger. Timber was conveniently logged with horses or oxen, and understandably, there was a limit to the distance that an animal could be expected to pull a heavy load. The logger used rivers and large streams where available to float the logs to a mill location. But in most of the heavily timbered valleys of the White Mountains, the streams were not large enough for an effective log drive. Thus it was that privately owned logging railroads played a key role in the removal of the virgin timber, for moving sawmill products to market, and for bringing supplies into the remote logging camps and small villages. The loggers' railroad was a temporary installation, often crude and lacking the construction of a foundation suitable for extended safe operation. But it didn't matter that much. The loggers were often using old equipment, operated at a slow speed, and seldom expected to operate their railroad more than 4 or 5 years. Much of the old-growth timber harvested in the White Mountains in the 1800s and the early 1900s was the profuse and resplendent red spruce as well as white pine. Hardwood logs were occasionally carried for specialty mills producing hardwood lumber or products such as flooring, bobbins, shoe pegs, and clothespins. Accidents on the logging railroads frequently resulted in deaths. A history of the White Mountain logging railroads is part of the lore of that fascinating era of timber kings, hardy loggers, and tough logging. Today, the United States Forest Service is responsible for maintaining these large tracts of land as wilderness areas. Wilderness is the land that was, wild land beyond the frontier, land that shaped the growth of the nation and the character of its people. Wilderness is the land that is rare, wild places where one can retreat from civilization, reconnect with the earth, and find healing, meaning, and significance. The Pemigewasset Wilderness in the White Mountains of New Hampshire is one such area. From 1893 to 1948, the Pemigewasset Wilderness was the scene of massive logging operations by timber baron J.E. Henry, and in later years, the Parker Young Company. Both ran log trains over the Black Brook Trestle. This trestle played an important role in transporting logs from remote locations of the Pemigewasset Wilderness. Now in the 21st century, 90 plus years later, Trestle 16 is still standing, rotten beyond belief and refusing to fall. The trestle may not handle the weight of a person, but it still stands. It is also said this is the only logging railroad timber trestle still standing in New Hampshire. Someday, this trestle will only be a memory. A steel bridge over Black Brook was erected by the U.S. Forest Service in the 1970s as a pedestrian crossing adjacent to the old timber rail trestle. Today, the steel girders of the Black Brook Bridge no longer span the brook. Their removal advanced the wilderness experience. The Forest Service maintains this wilderness by enforcing various restrictions, including prohibiting the use of motorized equipment and wheeled vehicles. The salvage beams would have to be removed without the use of modern machinery. When the Forest Service contacted Draft Animal Power Network about the Lincoln Woods project, DAPNet saw an educational opportunity to demonstrate the effectiveness of draft animal power in the 21st century. The Draft Animal Power Network is a nonprofit organization that provides connections to resources to advance the use of draft animals, highlighting the ongoing efforts of people throughout the Northeast and beyond who are educating, mentoring, and building community around animal power and sustainable land use. It is an organization that grew out of the Northeast Animal Power Field Days that were held for several years in central Vermont. At the field days, people who were actively using draft animals to provide all or part of their livelihood could interact and exchange ideas covering all aspects of the use of horses, cattle, and mules in harness and under yoke. It is those aspects of connecting, sharing, and educating that DAPnet has made its mission. Draft power was used in the 19th century as it was the only option to navigate the unforgiving terrain of the White Mountains. Today, however, draft power is becoming more popular. People are concerned with the impact left on their property from large skidders and mechanical equipment. Soil compaction and damage to existing and future tree growth is a growing concern. Draft power is very easy on the land if done properly. Soil compaction is of little concern, and young growth can be left undisturbed for future harvests. DAPnet was approached by the U.S. Forest Service in December of 2011. A small group of members visited the debris site, escorted by the Forest Service in January of 2012 to investigate the option of using draft horses to skid the salvaged steel beams from the wilderness. There were many obstacles to overcome, including downed trees and washouts that needed to be cleared for the horses to pass. A walking bridge over Franconia Brook would need to be crossed with the horses and all the equipment, and a high line would need to be erected over a washed portion in the trail because of flood damage during Hurricane Irene. But it was decided that it would be possible. Snow cover would be essential as the beams were going to be skidded out by log scoots. It was agreed we would schedule the project for the winter of 2013. DAPnet and the U.S. Forest Service had never done a project like this before. January saw the first significant snowfall of the winter season in the North Woods. Temperatures hovered around 10 degrees during the day and dipped well below zero at nightfall. After coordinating with the Teamsters and the Forest Service, a date was picked for the project. We would move in and set up camp on January 27, 2013. Several volunteers with DAPnet and the Forest Service arrived at the Kankamangas Ranger Station in Lincoln, New Hampshire on Sunday to begin the arduous task, hauling all the camp supplies 2 miles into the forest. Monday morning was brutally cold. The mercury hovered around 10 below zero at daybreak. After a hearty breakfast, the horses were harnessed and scoots were loaded and headed for the debris site, 5 miles into the wilderness. Once the group reached the base camp, final preparations for the horse hovel and cook shack were made. There was much anxiety and debate as to whether or not the horses would cross the 70-foot narrow walking bridge which led to the wilderness. There was no alternative water crossing for the horses and equipment, and if one horse balked at the idea of crossing, the project would be over before it began. But after some coaxing from the Teamsters, both teams willingly walked across the bridge and were on their way to the debris site 2 miles further into the forest. Once the horses reached the Black Brook debris site, there lay before them 10,000 pounds of steel I-beam, neatly stacked by the Forest Service and waiting to be loaded by hand onto the log scoots. Each beam weighed approximately 650 pounds, and great care was taken to load the beams so no one was crushed or hurt.
Much slip. Okay, hang on. Hold. Go.
You got it? Boom. You want to put this together? Yep.
Beams were carefully flipped onto the scoots, 4 at a time, and lashed with chains and binders. The first two loads were now secure and headed for the High Line. Once the loaded scoots reached the High Line, each beam was unloaded and sent 80 feet across a wire cable to an empty scoot waiting on the other side. A beam clamp was used to secure the beam to the High Line sheath, which increased the momentum of the process. Although time-consuming at first, the Forest Service became very efficient with the High Line, and the process sped up. With scoots reloaded and pointed towards the wilderness boundary at Franconia Brook, the horses pulled the 2,600-pound loads with confidence. The skid trail had been masterfully prepared by the Forest Service and their dedicated team of volunteers. Once the loads reached the wilderness boundary, volunteers were eagerly waiting to help unload. Tuesday morning again was bitter cold, but the snow had stopped after blanketing the forest with 3 inches of fresh powder. As the sun began to rise, we walked to the bridge for water. Many of us had our morning coffee watching the sun slowly emerge from the treetops. But there was much work to do today, and it had to be completed by sundown. The weather forecast was for freezing rain that evening, and a moderate warm front was approaching. This would soften the trail conditions and make it impossible to continue skidding the beams out. After a hearty breakfast, the teamsters had harnessed the horses and work crews pressed on into the forest. 4 loads of beams still remained, and it all had to come out today. By 4 p.m. that afternoon, the last hitch of steel and timber had been unloaded, and it was time to finish breaking down camp and packing supplies and equipment. Several loads of equipment and supplies were lashed to the scoots and sleds and ready to be pulled back 2 miles to the ranger station. By 8 p.m., the horses and last of the volunteers emerged from the Lincoln Woods. All involved were cold and tired, but extremely satisfied with what we had just accomplished. In the minds of many, draft animal power is as much a relic of the past as the White Mountain logging railroads of 100 years ago. However, in situations requiring, among other things, low impact and close maneuvering, short bursts of power, as well as steady forward motion, the utility of draft animals is available and appropriate for the work of the 21st century. And so, for a couple of frigid days in January, the utility of draft animal power returned to the woods of the White Mountains of New Hampshire.